Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our 60th webinar in the Offshore Wind Series, Learning from the Experts. I'm Gregory Lampman, the Senior Director of NYSERDA's Offshore Wind Program, and it's my pleasure today to be joined by our experts, Jim Bennett and Ian Voparil. Before I introduce our speakers, a few reminders for the participants and some background on the webinar series. Next slide, please. First, if you experience any technical issues, please don't hesitate to contact Adam Hauk at the email address at the bottom of this slide. As always, our webinar is being recorded, and the recordings from the presentations as with all the presentations from our webinar series, Learning from the Experts, will be available on NYSERDA's website. It may take a day or two for this one to get up, but they're all posted there, all 60 now. All participants have been muted. You will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. Please use the Slido feature to submit your questions, and those questions can be submitted at any point along the presentation. You don't need to wait until the end. Next slide, please. As you know, New York continues working to advance the responsible and cost-effective development of offshore wind as part of a diverse energy supply. Offshore wind is a critical component in achieving the state's energy reliability and decarbonization goals. And while offshore wind has provided clean energy to other parts of the world for several decades, this industry is relatively new to New Yorkers. To provide interested stakeholders and members of the public with access to impartial information and opportunities for engagement on specific topics of interest, NYSERDA is hosting the educational webinar series called Learning from the Experts to connect the public with independent experts on key topics related to offshore wind. We endeavor to select learning from the expert speakers based on their expertise and not necessarily for alignment of the opinions with NYSERDA and/or the state of New York. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of our presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views of NYSERDA or the state of New York. Next slide, please. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Jim Bennett and Ian Voparil. Both Ian and Jim have been very involved in the development of energy resources in the marine environment for years before the offshore wind industry started to emerge back in the 2010s. Jim is retired from federal service after 43 years of working through challenging issues of resource management on the Outer Continental Shelf. He served over 7 years with the Renewable Energy Program Manager at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, overseeing responsible development of offshore wind energy, and in fact, expanding the number of active offshore renewable energy leases from 4 to 27, extending from Massachusetts to the Carolinas. Jim is recognized both domestically and internationally as an expert on environmental review and the development of natural resources on the Outer Continental Shelf. Ian has 20 years of global experience in offshore wind energy development. He's managed venture integration for a deepwater division of an international oil and gas company. Ian was appointed to BOEM's Outer Continental Shelf Science Committee, the U.S. Oceans Resources Advisory Panel, an advisory panel for Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, and a panel with the National Academy of Sciences for Engineering and Medicine. Before joining the energy industry, Ian was a marine scientist and a university lecturer. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speakers, but I'll just note that if you have not seen Ian and Jim's podcast, Offshore Energy, you really need to take a look at it. It's both entertaining, educational, amusing, and they tell some really interesting stories. With that, over to you, Jim and Ian.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for the plug. Yes, and we really appreciate this invite, and we're looking forward to the discussion today, both to you, Greg, and everybody there at NYSERDA, and not only for the invite, but also for the you said now it's 60 webinars that you've conducted, which is a great contribution to the industry. And just to expand a little bit on my introduction, I wanted to note that, yes, I'm a former federal government with ocean energy issues, and I've been doing some consulting work since retiring a couple of years ago, including where I am now, which is the College of Staten Island. Go Dolphins. It's more of an academic environment, and it's very, very rewarding. I do want to mention, I want to reiterate the disclaimer, Greg, that indeed Ian and I have some opinions about things, but they don't necessarily represent the sponsors here, NYSERDA. They may not even represent a consensus between the two of us.
I'll
We'll
say,
see
Jim.
about that. Um, and we're not proponents of any particular sector or policies. But we do want to have a constructive discussion. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ian.
Well, thanks, Jim. Thanks, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here. I probably know many of you in the audience have had an awful lot of fun working in the offshore energy business for about the last 20 years. And I don't represent previous or current employers in my opinions. And it's going to be awfully fun to be here with Jim and talk about, what we can learn from offshore oil and transfer into offshore wind, and frankly, vice versa. So Jim, why don't we get going? I'm ready.
Okay, well, let's go to the next slide. And let's talk about what we're going to talk about, which is we've identified 6 topics basically that we think are probably most useful in comparing and contrasting the two industries and what they can contribute to each other. And that includes the most basic stuff, which is the technology and the engineering, which we'll talk about a little bit more in just a second. The policy framework is important. And of course, the regulatory process, the permitting process as we move into projects. And Ian's going to talk at length about economics. Go ahead, Ian.
No worries. Going to talk about economics. We're going to talk about the importance of stakeholders for both industries. And I can't join a talk and not talk about the importance of safety and ensuring that everybody goes home better than the way that they arrive to work each and every day. And we'll talk in specific about some of the changes in safety and the ways that we can all work together to improve safety for offshore activities together. And then we open it up to Q&A, right, from the rest of the audience.
Right.
You already heard instructions on how to do that. Thanks. We look forward to it. I'm sure there are great questions out there. So please feel free to drop them in, and we'll get going. Sound good, Jim?
It sounds good to me.
Slide.
Yes, we're going to do safety first, but we'll do questions and answers last. So it'll all work out.
It sounds great, Jim. I'll take it from the start of this slide. So first, we wanted to talk a little bit about, offshore oil and gas and offshore wind and technology and engineering. And I want to say really clearly right up front that there is no rivalry between offshore oil and gas and offshore wind. But there is this fascinating history of shared technologies, parallel engineering, innovation that has really driven both industries forward over the course of the last decades. Now, the offshore wind industry didn't start from scratch. It clearly stood partly on the shoulders of offshore oil and gas, leveraging about 50 years of a head start with hard-won marine expertise. But now the industries can also transfer information back and forth because many of the same people working in offshore wind have also worked or are working in offshore oil and gas. There's this foundation of sharing and best practice that we want to build together and be as efficient as possible to make energy as efficient as possible to deliver for people around the world. Now, the clearest examples of technology transfer, let's start there. They're probably foundations. Right, and you can see, I've got a couple of different things on this slide, but you can see a couple of really interesting pictures with timestamps on them from offshore oil and gas on the left-hand side of the screen. If you look down, there's one that's kind of in the middle, and you can see the progression into deeper and deeper water in meters from fixed structures in offshore oil and gas. And on the right, we have a general timeline of some of the key milestones in the history of offshore wind. So if we start with foundations, the 4-leg jackets that have been used for oil platforms for decades, and jackets probably reached an engineering pinnacle with Shell's Bullwinkle platform that was installed in 1988. You can see it there. It stands over 1,400 feet tall, and the jacket itself weighed about 49,000 tons. Think about it this way. It's the second tallest object ever to be moved to another position on Earth, assembled. And yes, I am purposefully using the present tense because the Bullwinkle platform is still in operation in the Gulf of America. Some close to almost 40 years of service from Bullwinkle. Okay. For our
Can I just add to that? I can't help, I can't resist the fact that what was formerly Minerals Management Service and is now BOEM, there is a model of the Bullwinkle platform, and it's just absolutely incredible. Even as a model, it runs floor to ceiling, and you can see the scale, and it's an absolutely wondrous engineering feat, and it gives you the idea of what the capabilities are of the oil and gas industry as we move into wind.
Thanks, Jim. And, for those in the audience who may not be familiar with Bullwinkle, Google it. There is mind-blowing picture and video of Bullwinkle actually being towed out of Ingleside, Texas, and through Port Aransas on its way into the Gulf of America. So it's just astonishing, the size and scale and complexity of moving big structures around the world in oil and gas. Now, for those of you involved in offshore wind here in the US, you know that Block Island Wind Farm was our first in the US, and it used a generally similar four-leg jacket as well. Block Island's foundations, I know Jim is going to talk about in more detail in a second, but most of the steelwork was done down in Houma, Louisiana. That's down the bayou in the oil patch, right? There's a clear transfer of tech and experience right there that's been actively working in the United States. And let's not forget that vessels like lift boat the Robert helped with Block Island while away from its normal home on the Gulf Coast. The highly specialized marine vessels that are in use in offshore oil and gas can also find work and opportunity in offshore wind, right? Heavy lift ships, cable laying vessels, offshore support and supply vessels are often used and developed by oil and gas. Even those in the Gulf Coast have found some great new customers during the offshore wind boom of our last administration. And we'll come back to that point later in the talk too. Next slide, please. I don't know about you. Take a look at this slide. Let it sink in. I love this slide because I think it's also something to study for the future of floating offshore wind by studying the lessons in the history of deepwater oil and gas in the Gulf. You see, I quote a source on the bottom here. If you take that title and Google it, you will find the original BOEM report, which is a 4-volume study. It's freely available online. And if you're like me and love things about the ocean, it's an excellent read about some of the literally crowning achievements of the energy industry of the last 100 years. We've got shoulders like crazy to stand upon from offshore oil and gas development in the United States. But let me get into the details of this slide here too, because I think they're instructive. So a couple of key points if you look at this slide. Now, in hindsight, floating oil and gas has proven to be tremendously successful and profitable, right? Now that we're standing in 2025, we can all look back and it seems like, wow, what a sure thing. It just needed the technology to develop to get there. But the transition from fixed platforms to floating platforms was project by project, took years, even decades, if you look at this slide, right? And even some of the pioneering projects were not commercially successful, even if they left a lasting technology legacy. The questions that were developing in a lot of the industry's minds in the late 80s and early 90s were largely settled later, right? In the late 90s and early 2000s. Each of these projects were massive single shots and had commensurate engineering and planning put in place. And still, some of these platforms were not successful. And that's because we're human. We all make mistakes. Nature doesn't care. And markets operate outside of our control, right? Some of the things that happened were unexpectedly low flow rates from certain platforms and low oil prices that occurred during the early 1990s and into the late 1990s. Caught many of the projects really on the wrong side of commercial success. Now, many of them, And for those of you familiar with the oil and gas industry in the Gulf of America, some of these names are probably pretty familiar to you. And some of these developments are still going strong. Now, I mentioned Bullwinkle before, right? So you can see its installation, and Bullwinkle is still going strong. Auger and Mars continue to go strong as well. Joliet, you can see there in blue, the first tension leg platform in the Gulf of Mexico, was only decommissioned earlier this year in 2025. Okay, so now back to the slide. If you look at the slide and you draw a line sometime in the late 1990s, maybe around 1996, 1997, if you draw a line through that history, you see what many in the industry consider a real inflection point. Deepwater oil and gas saw a boom starting after this period, and that was due really to three key levers improving for deepwater. What we call subsalt resource estimation, right? Our ability to find hydrocarbons beneath the salty layers in the sediment and the seafloor of the Gulf of Mexico really improved because of different ways to do seismic acquisition, signal processing, and supercomputing, frankly. Oil prices started to rebound after really historic lows in the mid-1990s. And supportive policy was put in place with the Deepwater Royalty Relief Act of 1995. Now, 1995, and then this shift, there's a couple of years there. And, we all recognize that it takes a few years for the conditions around a project to be, to kind of catch up. It takes a long time for offshore projects to have the right elements in place to then move forward. So this slide, I hope it excites you too, because I love it. And it always inspires me to think about the history that we can make today is helped shape by the actions that we take today for the future. Jim, over to you for the next slide.
Sure. I'm sorry I got dropped off there for just a second for an internet connection problem. Hopefully it didn't interrupt anything. If it happens again, I'll turn the video off. But I wanted to take the next step to follow on what Ian is talking about in terms of technology and engineering in the Gulf of Mexico, and how does this affect the wind industry. Well, the very first project that in the very first offshore wind farm, the Block Island wind farm, which was a state project with the state of Rhode Island, benefited from the fact that the fabrication yards in the Gulf of Mexico supporting the oil and gas industry were in a position to develop the foundations for the 5 turbines. I guess it is 5 turbines in Rhode Island. The picture on the left is the fabrication yard, and the picture on the right, I was fortunate enough to be down there when they were actually building the foundations that are now in the water at Block Island. So it's this kind of technology transfer, engineering know-how that can be synergistic between the two industries in a very, very positive way. Slide. Advance, please. Okay. But the point is not just the borrowing of some technology for a particular project. The long-term goal is the idea that these two industries can be synergistic in a way that they support each other. That, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, that possibly wind energy can be used to power the platforms that are exploring and producing oil and gas. It's a positive aspect of the integration of the two technologies. We hope to see more of it. The next thing we wanted to talk about is policy, and that is, you can hit the slide, please. Offshore energy policy, there are a number of shared objectives, or have been for quite some time now. And they both operate under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, which identifies the Outer Continental Shelf as a national resource to be developed for the benefit of the American public. And that's an important fundamental aspect of the Outer Continental Shelf resources. And the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which gave the authority to the Minerals Management Service to develop wind energy in addition to oil and gas energy. You can see there a listing of policies. I don't want to get into a policy debate about how to achieve various objectives, but the long-term energy security and affordability are espoused by pretty much all parties involved. Everybody likes job creation and the use of innovation to move the industries forward and the economic growth that's occurred. The carbon emissions and energy transition is not as clear cut, especially lately, as to whether it's a shared objective. But it has been in the mix for some time and is certainly supportive of the development of offshore wind. And I do want to make one last point about the energy transition. We use the term transition a lot, but it means different things to different people. And the idea, what you often hear espoused with regard to transition, is that at some point we're just going to drop all fossil fuels and we're going to flip the switch and we'll be totally electric. And I just don't think that's a realistic assessment of our resource situation or our politics or our economic factors. So I bring that up because when we're having discussions about transition, we need to be clear about what we mean by transition. And the way I view it, or the way I see it, is what the transition that's going to occur is the integration of these different technologies over the long term, rather than the switch from one to another. And they're both going to grow. Let's talk about the regulatory process. Anything to add on that, Ian?
No, I was wondering what those last two were doing down there in the current environment, Jim. But I think you cleared it up well. You know, the devil's often in the details, right? As we work through different policy and different intended consequences and unintended consequences. So, you know, it's up to all of us to stay in the game and to continue to work towards better, because we're never going to be perfect. So stay in the game, keep working.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great point. I think that point's going to be reinforced as we continue to discuss here. Let's talk real quickly about the regulatory process. Of course, as I mentioned, both the oil and gas program and the renewable energy program were developed under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. And both, although they're a little bit different, and you can click the next picture, they both follow a basic process of planning for development, leasing activities to enable the private sector to become part of the game, exploration activities or construction activities, planning for construction for offshore wind, and then finally development and production itself. The names are a little bit different as you move through, but if you click the next slide, please. If we can use the OCS renewable authorization process as an example, you can see that the planning and analysis takes a couple of years. The leasing itself can take up to 2 years, up to 5 years of site assessment, and a couple of years of construction and operations, 25 to 33 years, depending upon the lease. These are basically the same steps in both processes. And I think the important thing to keep in mind in permitting is that they also have the same environmental requirements, although right now those are under review and maybe changing, but they operate under the requirements of NEPA, and some of the things that we've learned in the Gulf of Mexico, particularly with regard to compliance with NEPA, have been applied in the Atlantic for some of the projects there. Well, let's go to the next slide. Well, actually return to that slide, and the similarity.
Jim, I think we've lost your audio. Jim, can you hear me?
I think we've lost Jim.
We may have lost Jim. Let's, let me pick it up from here, and then we'll come back to Jim if he's able to join us. If you could just click one more time.
I can join
Oh,
you.
good, you're there. All
I
right, Jim, come on.
apologize. I don't know what that is. Somewhere out in the ether. Let me just move a little more quickly through this. But in addition to reasonable return, the requirements for public review are also there, both under NEPA consultation processes and the rest of the permitting process. I think what's important is the differences in the regulatory process. Click, please. Include that the auction method is a little bit different, and we'll talk in more detail about that in a couple minutes. And the contractual status is a little bit different too. I think when the regulations were developed, I know as the regulations were developed for offshore wind, there was a desire to keep more discretion on the part of the federal government, and as a result, we have less contractual obligations, if you will, with offshore wind. And a lot of that is being worked out now with the stop work orders and the like. So these are important distinctions, even though the bulk of the process is the same. So on that last point on contractual status, we want to keep in mind that the durability of the obligations on the part of the government is an issue that we're going to be debating for some time. The durability of contracts and permit approvals of construction operations plans is an issue that we need to address. But let's move on to what is, I think, the crux of the whole issue, and that's the economics. It's all about the economics, and we're going to talk about the project economics. Ian will in just a moment, and then I have several points to make about lease pricing, auction process, what I consider distortions to the economic process for offshore energy, and the possibility of revenue sharing. Back to you, Ian.
Sounds good, Jim. Let's go next slide. And I'm not sure economics drives everything, but it certainly is a very important factor to consider. And so let's start first, and let me share with you a little bit of a developer's perspective on project economics for offshore projects. And let's use this cash flow diagram that was that I found on the internet. Thanks very much to the source for posting this. This is a pretty nice diagram, though it's not specific to a particular offshore project. I wanted to use something general. And let's talk a little bit about this, because I think it explains a lot for how offshore oil and gas and offshore wind are very similar in some regards, but they have key differences that tend to play out as their projects mature and as their opportunities mature. Okay, so let me explain this. Give me a couple minutes. So along the x-axis here, if we look at this cash flow diagram, right, is time. And the y-coordinate shows money flowing into a project or money flowing out of a project, right? Money created and flowing into a project is positive, is up. Money flowing out is down, right? And it's common practice in these kinds of cash flow models to account for the time value of money in these. But I'm going to brush over kind of time value of money calculations because it doesn't really impact our general observations and conclusions that we can draw from this. Okay, so this figure itself is particularly from an oil and gas development, but offshore wind projects will follow a same general type. Understanding the project economics really helps to understand a developer's perspective on what drives value from the projects. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the key commonalities. The first one, if we look at time, and time of this project starts on the left and then progresses year by year to the right, right? Both types of projects require massive initial investments in leasing, permitting, surveying, front-end engineering, eventually getting to construction. And this spending occurs over several years, right? All of this negative flow. Sorry, you can't see my cursor, can you? I'm writing my cursor on the screen. You can see all of the downward flows out of a project, right? Creating a really large initial negative outflow of money. That's a lot of risk for a developer to be taken back. before any revenue is returned from the project because of its production of oil, gas, or electricity. Okay, so that's first thing first. Second similarity, the operational lifespan of both offshore oil platforms and offshore wind farms is typically decades. This long-term horizon requires financial models that can project costs, revenues, and cash flows over 20 and 30 years or more. You know, from a personal finance perspective, can you imagine projecting how much you'd be spending and how much you'd be getting 20, 30 years from now? There is an art and a science to this that's highly developed in both industries, right? The third thing that's very similar are both industries have what we call a front-loaded risk profile, okay? They face significant construction risk during the development phase. These early phases of it, and you can see some of the writing, right? Seismic survey, first exploration well, appraisal wells, then development approval and moving forward. And then you see the blue bars drop to very large amounts, right? That's when you start buying steel and moving it places where you're starting to build the thing that you will ultimately install offshore. Delays, cost overruns, technical challenges to the development are common and can heavily impact the final cost and profitability of this project. Now, the cash flow profile reflects this, and the highest risk amounts are actually before the asset is operational, right? Makes sense. Now, fourth, project economics for both sectors are highly sensitive to external variables. I know we all really feel that around the offshore wind sector too, and we'll talk a little bit about how the offshore oil and gas sector has felt that in previous decades, right? Primary easy example is the commodity price for oil and gas, right? Where our return of revenue is directly tied to a volatile price of hydrocarbons available from the market. Now, in offshore wind, the revenue stream can be affected by policy risk, right, as we just mentioned, but also changes in tax credits or regulations, right? They can significantly impact the financial viability of both types of projects. Okay, so now what are the key differences that project economics can show us between the two sectors, right? The first one, it's hard to see in this graph, but the first and primary one is exploration cost. Offshore oil and gas has substantial exploration costs to drill deep water wells, right? The exploration well, the appraisal wells. A single well in the Gulf of America can easily cost between $30 and $100 million, depending upon the depth and complexity of the well, okay? How often is that exploration well a positive, a success? Well, less often than not. The success rate for ultra deep water wells actually fell from about 20% in the early 2010s and teens to only about 3% in 2020, in the early 2020s, let's say. Okay, significant risk of sunk costs that you never get back, right? And in oil and gas, there's a saying that all prospects look good until you drill them, right? And that's a real truism, that you don't know the potential value of your prospect literally until you are putting holes in the ground and trying to flow oil or gas back through the system, okay? In offshore wind, those pre-development costs for resource assessment and site characterization are expensive, and I'm sure every offshore wind developer in the United States feels the expense of those right now, but it's not the same magnitude as occurs in oil and gas, okay? Okay, another difference is revenue certainty. Now, we all know in offshore wind that projects are usually supported and financed based upon the contractual arrangement, like a power purchase agreement, which provide a fixed price and stabilize revenue expectations that reduce exposure to otherwise wholesale market price fluctuations, right? Oil and gas projects are different, and most of them are tied to the commodity price for oil and gas. And just to give you an idea of how much that varies, if you look at the WTI crude oil prices for the last 30 years, kind of like the lifetime of a project, you'll see prices that vary from below $20 a barrel to prices above $120 a barrel. And between years, you'll sometimes see 50% swings on average price. Okay, so there's a lot of price risk that's still baked into offshore oil and gas that just doesn't exist for offshore wind when successful. And I'd say finally, another significant difference is environmental risk, right? Offshore wind has minimal risk of really catastrophic environmental and human events like oil spills or blowouts, as many of us have experienced. The potential liability and cleanup costs from those events and decommissioning a project at the end of its lifetime are built into the cash flow models for oil and gas. Decommissioning costs are certainly built into models for offshore wind as well too. But I just wanted to put that out there because we'll talk a little bit more about safety later. Next slide. Jim, let me hand it back to you now as we drop into these other issues around project value.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the economics that you mentioned about how the very large upfront costs, some of the leasing costs that are associated with offshore wind. A quick history. If you look on the chart that you see here on the far left, is the sale in 2016 offshore New York, which is ultimately the Equinor's Empire Wind project now. And at that point, up until that point, leases had been going for hundreds of thousands of dollars and maybe $1 million or $2 million, and this went for $42 million, and it was absolutely unheard of that there would be that much money involved. In the Massachusetts sale, a couple of years later, 3 areas which were previously 2 areas that were unbid upon just 3 years earlier went for $135 million each. And then we had the massive New York Bight sale in February of 2022, including a $1.1 billion lease, which I was the one that signed that on behalf of the government. My hand was shaking. $1.1 billion for an offshore lease. Raises question about what is the objective here? Is it revenue for the government, or is it viable offshore wind projects? And I'm going to leave that to the audience to think that through. I will note that it does. I know it looks like there's a big drop in prices in 2022 with the North Carolina sales and then the 5 leases out in California. But that's actually not the case at all. Totally different market, totally different expectations. The previous North Carolina sales went for $9 million for one area, and these went for 155, 160 million a piece. This is in North Carolina in an unregulated market. And then, of course, out in California, where there's no established development going on right now, and these are very speculative. So lease prices have gone way up, and that's a big part of the equation. Next slide. One of the reasons may be the auction process. There is a difference between the oil and gas program in that they are sealed bids. Sealed bids meaning you make one bid, you seal it in an envelope, and you submit it to the government. And you may win, you may not, but it's only the one bid. Whereas the wind energy auction was set up to be an ascending bid process, which is more like an actual auction, like you think of in terms of like an art auction, where you see your competition to a certain degree, and you decide whether you want to continue to bid. And that may be adding to the price for wind, especially in a very speculative environment. So that's an important aspect of things, the auction process. And next slide, I do want to make a quick point about policy, or what I'm calling distortions. We have obviously policy drives and tweaks and guides what goes on in the offshore and what industries will be moving forward more rapidly. But what we've seen over the last few years, and actually for the past several administrations, is 180-degree swings in policy. And to make a long story short, it's not on one side of the aisle or the other. these swings are very, very substantial, and they make it much, much more volatile for the industry to be moving forward. And I think that's an issue again with regard to durability that is something that needs to be addressed. And then finally, with regard to economics, I do want to click one more time. I do want to mention the issue of revenue sharing, and that's, as we know, the Outer Continental Shelf is under federal jurisdiction, and the revenues generated through lease sales return to the federal government, to the general.
Jim, I lost you again. Jim, can you hear me? You know, Jim, it seems like you're having Wi-Fi issues. Greg, NYSERDA, am I the only one?
Nope, same issues.
I'm back again. I
You're back.
apologize.
Where's Jim? Come on.
Let me just close this out before we move to stakeholders, Ian. And that's that the revenue sharing is something that developed over a long period of time, took 10 years to implement. And I just throw it out there as something to consider as to whether the issues would be different if federal revenues from OCS for offshore wind were shared with the states, whether there'd be more common interests that would move things along. And with that, I'm going to move on to stakeholders, and let's click, please, and just ask the questions. You know, are we just going through the process with stakeholders, or are we actually transferring information? Are consultations simply required, or is it co-development of activities that we are really after? And Ian, you're also going to talk about non-technical risks. So as we move forward, why don't we go to the next slide, and over to you, Ian.
It sounds really good, Jim. Thank you. And just watching the clock, you know, we hope to preserve about 10 minutes for Q&As. I don't see any Q&A coming into the Slido, so we might keep talking, but if you'd like to add questions, just pop them in now and we'll make sure that we stop in time. You know, Jim and I wanted to ensure that we talk about stakeholders and what we call non-technical or above ground risks, because they are so critical to ultimate project success. Now, hear me out. I got a bunch of different things going on this slide. Forgive me, okay? Because you may not be familiar with all of them, and some of you are probably very familiar with all of them. But let me just walk you through it to try to give you an idea of why these are the things that jump to my mind when we talk about how important stakeholders are, okay? Now, first off, I hope you see the phrase, tell me, show me, involve me written there. And you can see I've accredited that to most societies around the world. Now, you may also be familiar with where that phrase has come from, and it's often attributed to Ben Franklin, who's describing a model for learning that shifts really from passive instruction, right, tell me, to active participation, involve me, and the impact that that has on us all, right? Ben Franklin actually said, tell me and I forget, show me and I remember, involve me and I learn. You know, sitting with my high school last night, we were talking, I was struggling to explain the difference between quantum and Bohr models of atoms. Do you guys remember that from high school? Holy cow. And I figured, my gosh, I cannot remember the key differences because those were the things that I just listened to and memorized the first time I heard them and never really practiced with in the rest of my life. Well, over the last 20 years, oil and gas industry has also recognized that this paradigm applies to the way that society feels about offshore energy projects too. There's a huge shift from society being largely passive, literally and figuratively out of sight and out of mind around offshore energy, to wanting to be, and in fact needing to be, actively participating in the project design, really participation by many groups that seek to fundamentally shift and change a project, right? And so from a developer's perspective, these projects are already really complicated, right? Threading the needle of all of the different forces to try to build a project that is successful. It's torturous, right? And now people also want to help define what good looks like for you. It's been a mindset shift in the industry to recognize this. And my career has demonstrated this, literally as I've this shifting societal expectation hand in hand. I started with an oil and gas company as an offshore subject matter expert on environmental issues and largely dealt with compliance issues for those projects around the world. I had a fresh PhD in oceanography, and I was feeling pretty smart about oceanography, and was able to go and apply it to all kinds of interesting environmental compliance issues, right? Muds and cuttings on the seafloor, and how far will they spread? What is the sound pressure level of different activities that we do offshore? And is it noisy enough to potentially disturb animals like whales? We progressed. After a few years in, I and the company were recognizing that other issues like space use conflicts with other ocean users were really popping up. They were becoming very considerable and important to address both technically properly, but also with great relationships, right? The company was recognizing and feeling one part of this. They were feeling delays because we couldn't get permits. They were feeling sometimes public and stakeholder protest about our activities offshore, and realized that we had to do something. Now this is called non-technical or above ground risk management, but at the time I stepped into a newly created position, and I had the honor to lead the team responsible for those risks across the entire global offshore exploration and development portfolio. We learned that we had to grow from addressing an issue technically, like with the best available science. That's just table stakes now. Now we also have to engage the right people, ensure that we involve, for example, local scientists and local stakeholders and local ocean users to ensure that we understand their concerns right from the very start of projects, rather than waiting until we think we have all of the detailed engineering and design complete, and then we just go consult with them, right? That's a pretty uncomfortable position for a developer who are largely technology organizations that really want to deliver value, right? And that's the slide on the right-hand side of this. If you're in the industry, oil and gas or offshore wind, you may have seen this before. This is the bird beak of value realization slide. And really what by the way, it's called bird beak because if you look at the blue and the red lines, it kind of looks like the head of a seagull. I'll take that. Maybe it's a different bird, but everybody says it looks like a seagull, and I agree. The real value that you create in a project is in the definition phase. Have you defined a good project? Do you know what a good project looks like? Not necessarily in the execution phase where you deliver the project. Now, you can use this from a really technical perspective, and we often do in value assurance in major energy companies. But from a non-technical perspective, society wants to be more involved in good project definition than ever before, and that's not going to change. Now, Jim, bringing this back to offshore wind, I mentioned a little bit of my history, and when offshore wind started to grow in the United States, say 2015-ish, I was really excited because I saw you putting in place requirements for stakeholder engagement and public consultation that showed that you were learning from the opportunities created by the oil and gas industry. We started doing this because we saw project value being removed. You guys put the regulations in place right from the front. Next slide. Would you tell us a little bit more about that?
Hey, if I might, Jim, just want to let you know, Ian, that we do have questions coming in, so they may not be visible to you on the software platform, but we do indeed have questions.
Okay, let me be real quick, and we'll cover safety as quickly as we can. Just on the stakeholders, this is really a progression of what Ian is talking about in terms of tell me, show me, and involve me. The nature of public involvement has been altered greatly. Back in the 80s and 90s in the Gulf of Mexico and elsewhere, the public involvement was pretty much restricted to procedural steps to get public comment and written submitting through hearings. And that has progressed. And I think the wind industry, particularly on the East Coast, has been very, very good in that regard. In terms of opening things up to town hall meetings and workshops and involving an existing or in a created intergovernmental state task forces. And as a result, I think we've had better, it's not perfect, but I think we've had better involvement from the stakeholder standpoint. And that's a very positive thing. And that may be as much a result of the progression of public involvement as it is a gain from the offshore oil and gas program, but it's a positive thing nonetheless. What's your key points on safety there, Ian?
Yeah, I figure let's save some time for questions. So let me move quickly through these. But I'm from oil and gas, and I can't have a meeting without talking about safety. In fact, I really noticed the change when I changed industries. Because in oil and gas, even if you're an office worker and even having office worker meetings, you still take a minute at the beginning of every meeting to talk about a safety issue that's common to all of the people in the meeting. You live and breathe thinking about how to do things safely, not just your operations offshore, not just the transfer of some heavy piece of equipment from a moving vessel onto a platform, but in the way that you drive your car, right? In the way that you don't talk on the phone while you're driving your car, these kinds of things. So I want to move very quickly through this. And I'll just say that if you think about, thank you, which industry has the better safety performance, you probably got a lot of thoughts floating around in your mind. Offshore oil and gas has an awful lot of process safety risks, the risk for explosion, the risk for fire, with people living in close proximity to the production activity. The safety process and process safety management that's developed in the oil and gas industry is really excellent. And so it's easy for offshore wind to borrow, and in fact, they have many of the key attributes of that, right? So that's the high level. We don't expect that there are catastrophic events with most offshore wind farms, but there are a lot of occupational hazards for individuals because of the work that they have to do in offshore wind, working at height, working in high voltage or near in proximity to high voltage equipment, climbing ladders, transferring from a moving floating vessel onto a facility. Those are all hard and complicated and need to be focused on. Next slide, please. And so for those of you who are safety professionals, I'm not telling you anything new, but safety really requires a holistic approach to the development of technology and standards, management systems so that you can manage and take corrective actions about how well you're doing managing safety, right? Really listening to all the way to improving the culture and the mindset around safety. And I'll just say that a key part of this journey for offshore oil and gas has been a real focus on human factors. And I'm not sure every company involved in offshore wind around the world has gotten to the same realization of the importance of human factors. Now, what are human factors? Human factors are the reality that people who are working offshore have hard jobs, they're busy, they're moving around a lot, they have to do acts that are inherently unsafe, like transferring from a ship to a platform, and they have to do so in ways that is very pressured, right? A lot rides upon the performance of these individuals out servicing the field to ensure that it's producing value for the company. We have to recognize that and then create space that all of those things can be managed well. We have to create the opportunity for mental health programs that support people. We have to enforce fatigue management and intelligent scheduling. You can't overburden staff and expect them not to be tired. We have to strengthen safety leadership. People can intervene and stop work whenever they feel it's unsafe, right? As well as prioritizing some of the human-centric design and engineering standards that recognize that people will always make mistakes. We can't expect to have perfection from people to ensure safety. We have to recognize that people are inherently imperfect and still be safe in their actions. I'll stop there. Jim, do you have any comments? And
No,
otherwise, we're going
I
to
think
you,
we
Greg.
need to move on and let people, let some of the questions get asked so we can answer them as best we can.
Thank you. Greg, back to you.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. Yeah, you can see my camera coming back on as sort of the music starting for you. So you got us with Bullwinkle at the very beginning, basically suggesting that, well, saying that Bullwinkle was the second largest structure moved. Do you know what the first largest is? And then additionally, how does the size of offshore wind machines, modern machines, compare to oil and gas platforms, both the elevation above the sea surface and the depth in which they're being built?
Man, good question. So what's the first largest thing moved? I actually don't know. And you know why I have a particular focus on Bullwinkle? It's because of a company that I used to work for that was very, very proud of Bullwinkle. So I'd be happy to hear what's the largest structure, but recognize too that Bullwinkle was moved intact, at least the foundation, until it was installed in place. And there have been a couple of really large structures moved as well, not necessarily intact. Some of them were assembled in place. So I don't know that one. That next question, Greg, that was around, sorry, remind me what the second part of
the relative size of modern wind turbines, both above the sea surface and below, as compared to oil and gas platforms above and below.
You bet. Jim,
below the sea surface, if you're talking about conventional jacket structures, obviously the wind turbines are not nearly as deep as what's going on in the Gulf of Mexico. Above ground, I think the turbines are much larger and getting larger too. Above ground, above the sea surface, excuse me.
Above the sea surface. Yeah, turbines are much taller than offshore oil and gas facilities. Although an individual offshore oil and gas facility will be much more massive than a single turbine. Depths, right? Let's go to depths. Fixed depth for turbines to a fixed foundation, 60 to 80 meters is kind of the max, right? Water depth. Fixed depth to a floating wind, which is a bit of a developing technology, about 200 meters so far. There have been a couple deeper than that. Oil and gas regularly is now installed in 9,000 feet of water. Okay. So we're talking 3,000 meters. You can see a little bit of it on that figure that I showed you, but
and part of that
far deeper.
Part of that reflects the maturity of the industry, because there's projections the technical possibilities for floating wind are way out there.
Yeah. So on the revenue sharing question, so understanding that there is some revenue sharing in instances for oil and gas development, but as we know, there isn't revenue sharing for offshore wind. Can you talk a little bit about the intention behind the revenue sharing mechanism for oil and gas and why it wouldn't necessarily translate to offshore wind?
Well, the rationale behind the revenue sharing is that the Gulf states, while producing like a quarter of the domestic oil production for the U.S., we're not receiving the royalties that were associated with offshore activities in under federal jurisdiction. And yet they were receiving substantial amounts of impacts that were associated with the offshore activity. So that is what took several decades and a decade to implement. That is what was driving the revenue sharing in the Gulf of Mexico. As an initial program, a nascent program on the East Coast in particular for offshore wind, nothing was in place and the impacts were not being realized. So the question becomes, well, should we be recognizing the impacts, and should the states be sharing in the revenues? I think it's just a question of timing as much as anything, as well as the question itself. But the time, it's a little early yet, I think, for that to be resolved. If that answers your question, I think.
No, that was good. And I'm sorry, we're just about out of time. One last wrap-up question I'd like to ask everyone is, so what's next for offshore wind? brief answer, if you would, please.
We need at this point, right now, long term, it's very hard to tell. Short term, we need to look to the states, obviously, to make things happen. And I'd like to suggest that few states, if any, are in a better position to serve as a leader for offshore wind than the state of New York. And the work that NYSERDA has done and is doing is tremendous, and their ability and their desire to continue working and find solutions for the development of offshore wind, I think, is going to be key to the success of offshore wind.
And I'd say just that I hope that from an individual perspective, those interested get opportunity to work in places where offshore wind is moving forward faster. And from a supply chain perspective, it sure would be nice to see some domestic manufacturers of specialty parts of offshore wind make better progress internationally, so that when the industry comes back, we're better prepared to build here.
Great. Well, thank you, Ian, and thank you, Jim. Really appreciate your insights and your expertise here today. Appreciate you being with us, and thank you all for joining us for this Learning from the Experts webinar. A reminder that the webinar recording and the presentation slides will be available on the NYSERDA website. It'll just take a couple of days for us to get that up. You can register for future webinars through our events page at wind.ny.gov. Encourage you to check out past webinars on NYSERDA's YouTube channel. And having done 60 of these, if you have a topic you would like to request for the series, please email us and let us know. It's offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov, or you can fill out our Learning from the Experts survey posted on the events page. So thank you both, gentlemen, for your presentation today, and thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you to NYSERDA.
Bye, guys.